Top of the hour, according to my clock.
Let's take one more minute and we can start. All right, time to go. So welcome everyone. We are Leif and Yaron. Well, I'm Yaron.
And I'm Leif.
And we're at the GNAP working group. And let's go. The note well applies to this meeting. So if you're new to the IETF or haven't read these materials yet, please take some time, go through them, and understand the implications, especially IPR implications of whatever's being said at the meeting. A few tips or requests. Please stay muted unless you're speaking. We are not on, other than chairs and speakers, we're not on video. If you present, please go on video. If you're asking a question, you might want to go on video, your call. There are no blue sheets. Those are generated automatically. And I believe this is this. Yeah, there's a participant guide. If you're new to Meet Echo, I think it's a good idea to take a look. No blue sheets. We do need a minute taker. And as Leif said before we started, it's a great opportunity for someone who's new to the group to get involved and to get to know the people, to ask people for their names, to clarify points and so on. We need a minute taker. Please let us know if you can do it. And I'll stop at this. Anybody?
I see Swedes in the group, and I will start calling on you because you know me if somebody else doesn't volunteer. So Diego, Olle, Steve-O.
It's kind of critical to have someone take minutes, otherwise we simply cannot have a reasonable meeting.
I have seen, I have heard my name, but I'm afraid that I will have to leave before the end of the meeting. So I'm sorry about that. Next time, Leif, I promise.
Thank you, Diego. I'll hold you to that. And Olle, you said that he won't be able to stay either. So anyone else?
I can try taking notes, Christina here, but I may
Thank
need
you.
to.
Thank you,
very much,
Christina.
Christina.
And
the preferred
if
way
there's
is to just do it in
something
the note-taking tool.
Yeah, I have the CodeEMD open.
Excellent. And please ask people, don't hesitate to ask people for their names, or if there's a point you didn't catch, just ask. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Please speak up by raising, or please queue to speak up by raising your hand in the application. The agenda for today is almost exclusively about the core protocol and will be led by the editorial team. At the very end of the meeting, we will discuss next steps. Denis prepared some additional material. We will get to that only if time allows, and well, depending on how we go with the main topics for discussion. And after the meeting, everybody is welcome to meet at the Gather room number 8. Where we can speak more informally about the protocol and where we're going. And with that, I'll pass it to, is it Aaron?
Am I starting this?
Oh, yeah.
I don't remember what our first slide is, actually.
Are the chairs sharing the slides, or are we going to? The editors put all of our slides into one deck, that one deck that we sent along.
Yeah. So yes, please share the slides.
Okay. Aaron, do you want to do that, or? Okay, cool.
All those handed over to you when we switch over.
Just go ahead anytime.
We can do that, of course, but I think it's more efficient if Aaron does.
Sure. Sorry, 1 second. There we go.
Yeah.
All right, hi, I'm Aaron Parecki for the note takers. Rough agenda of what the
Aaron,
editors have. Yeah?
That's the wrong slide deck. That's from the last interim.
Oh my gosh. Thank you.
They all look the same.
They all look the same, and time is going very quickly. That's the other problem here. I was like, surely it's still February. Justin, I don't think they have it. Do you have it handy?
Yeah, I'll do it.
I am not sure why it's not showing up in my Google list slide.
Sorry, just making sure I'm sharing my screen. All right, so just let me know when to advance.
Yeah. That's good.
And it's the right slides
Window.
too.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Right. So, yeah, the agenda. Is that looking?
Yeah,
funny
it
for
doesn't
anybody
look.
else?
Yeah, it's funny for me too.
It's got like
Yeah,
two Chrome windows
Justin,
overlapping.
can you unshare and reshare?
It's presentation mode in this for some reason. Let me try that again.
Can you share just the one window?
Yeah, I'll try that. This is why I don't usually like being the one to
Fair.
do this.
If you just send me that link, I can pull it up too.
Yeah, I'll send it over on Slack. Give me a sec. All right. So there we go.
On.
Okay. Let's see if that works any better.
Oh yeah,
There we go. That seems
Yeah.
to be working.
This looks better.
Just go with this.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, the rough agenda of what the editors have in mind for topics to cover today. I'm going to start with the update to the core docs, talking about what we have changed since IETF 109. Some of that has been covered already in the interim meetings, but we are assuming that not everybody was at all of those. So we'll recap those as well. We talk about the sort of an overview of what we think the next larger topics will be for discussion and for future work. And then there's a couple of specific topics to discuss, which the other editors will chime in on and cover. So subject identifiers and on-device use cases, SSI, things like that. All right. So next slide, differences since IETF 109. We have everything linked handily in this slide deck. So the slide deck, I believe you can download from the meeting materials if you are curious, and then all those links are clickable. So we have published two incremental drafts. 04 is the current draft, and this is the full diff, but we're going to break this down. Go ahead to the next slide. Everything that we have been working on in the draft is captured in GitHub. So that includes the discussions about what's been going on, the some justifications and thoughts going into those threads. Everything is captured as issues and then created as pull requests to actually change the document. So you can click on that link, which looks at all of the pull requests that have been merged that are the diffs of between the two documents. 25 pull requests in total, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. So go ahead to the next slide. Functional changes. So these numbers are issue numbers on GitHub, and again, if you're curious about some of the details about these changes, you can click on those or find the issue number on the GitHub repo to look at the sort of problem summary, which is usually how the issue starts, and then there'll be a discussion about how everybody thought best to resolve that particular issue. So starting at the top, there was previously another option for sort of kicking off the flow, which was to use a short URL instead of a long or regular URL. That kind of overlapped too much with the regular URL redirect / the sort of QR code device style redirect, and we thought it wasn't needed, so that is now dropped. A lot of you'll sort of see this theme here throughout these changes, which is a lot of what we're trying to do is simplify. So trying to reduce the number of optional pieces to make it just so that it is less normative text, less optional pieces, so that there's more chance of actually having something functional and interoperable. The next one, 140, that is we dropped the section in the spec that talked about how to request OpenID Connect claims. We thought that was sort of stepping too far out of the realm of the core goals of GNAP, and thought it'd be best left to specify that, so that something like OpenID Connect can actually specify that on top of GNAP instead of the other way around. Basically, we thought there was too many ways we could mess that up if we put it into the core, and it wouldn't actually capture the real intent of, or the real goals of OpenID Connect going in this direction. 129.67, so that is the continuation request is when the client is continuing to ask for progress updates on the grant. There were, again, two different ways to handle it. Now there's one way. It is using access tokens to make that request. Okay, change access token request and response. There's a whole bunch of issues linked there. That was kind of a large syntactical change, and we have some slides talking about those in a minute, but basically there's a large syntax change talking about how the request and the response are formatted, again, to bring simplicity and consistency to the spec. 152, that key information, that was essentially just refactoring the spec itself, not any functional changes, but it is moving the whole section that talks about how to present keys and how key proofing works. And there still are several different options for that within the spec. But that whole section is now like broken out into a specific section because it's referenced now by many different places in the spec. 122, 163, grouping interaction modes. So interaction modes are the different ways that a client can say it can interact with the user. It can tell the server, hey, I can redirect the user in a browser, or I can show them a code on a screen. I can be redirected to, or I cannot be redirected to, things like that. Those are all the different modes. Those are now grouped and labeled more explicitly so that hopefully just by looking at the JSON syntax, you have a better idea of what each of those pieces is actually meant to do and don't have to go and look it up, hopefully. Lastly, dropped reading the grant and token. Again, this was in the theme of trying to simplify and remove optional things. Nobody seemed to care about having this option available, and this was previously a way to sort of have the client query the server to ask about tokens and ask about progress reports and things like that. But without any concrete use cases or concrete needs, it's just generally better to not have those options in there so that there's less stuff to even worry about in the first place. Whew. Okay, so next slide. This is an example of the new syntax for requesting an access token. So you'll see there's this sort of container access token with the little yellow border on the outside. And that is now meant to say, hey, the client is asking for an access token. And then within that are the different aspects of the request. One of those aspects is called access. That is a new name for it. And that talks about, it's a full object that talks about the different kinds of thing it's actually asking for. So that might be, excuse me, that might be asking for specific actions, which kind of roughly correspond to OAuth scopes. It might be asking for access to particular APIs at specific locations. Those are those URLs. You can throw in data types in there as well. So those are all now grouped there. Those don't have to be rich objects. It can also just be a string. So the simple case is that one that's called reference or labeled reference, where it's just read. So the idea is that that would correspond to some sort of rich thing on the server side, on the authorization server, that isn't necessarily described in detail by the client. So again, we're trying to make it so that the simple cases work simply, but you do have more flexibility to be more specific if you need to. And then flags and label, those are again other aspects of the request. So flags are broken out instead of, I think we used to have it as Boolean values, but now the presence of the string there indicates that it is part of the request. Those are, again, things that the client is requesting. And then label as if the client is asking for, it's really only useful if the client is asking for more than one access token. It's asking the server to label that token with that label when it returns the multiple tokens. So again, this is, I believe everything in this was previously in the spec as far as the functionality goes. The syntax is new, and it's meant to be hopefully a little bit clearer about how things are grouped and how to find and look these things up. Next slide. So same idea here. This is actually only slightly different than the previous syntax, but this is the part where the client tells the authorization server how it can interact with the user. So there's two parts to the interaction with the user. There's how the client can start the interaction and how the client can finish the interaction. So the start would be, I can redirect the user's browser because I'm interacting with the user in a browser already. Or it could be that it's more like a browserless device or like a a smart TV where it doesn't have a browser, it doesn't have the ability to interact with the user that way, but it can show them a code, like a user code where they can type it in on a separate device. So those are the two different modes in this example of how the client can start the interaction and then how the client can finish the interaction. If the client has the ability to be redirected back to from the authorization server, then that's method redirect. There's also a method, I believe it's called, now I'm forgetting the name of it. Doesn't matter, push, that's what it is. Method push, where if the client has the ability to receive a post request directly, so that would be something that's like on a server rather than on a mobile phone. That's another option as well. Or it could omit this because it doesn't have a way to handle a redirect or any sort of response back from the server, in which case it would fall back to polling. But the idea is that these are now grouped into the start and finish so that it's more clear what the request is actually representing. And then that hints at the bottom, there's only one defined, which is the locales of that the client can suggest to the authorization server. But that is meant to be there for other kinds of hints as well from the client. That's kind of the client requesting that the server behave a certain way. Obviously, it can't enforce that, but it is a request from the client. So the grouping is the main new thing in this. Again, these functions were already there before. Okay, next and last slide for me. Editorial changes. We did a whole bunch of this stuff, and again, these aren't super critical. I'm not going to spend too much time on the details, but the idea with the editorial changes is it's just stuff that we thought read better in the spec, and this is fixing typos, clarifying language. It's not changing any functionality or any syntax or anything like that. So did a handful of that, and there's a couple of actually new fixes since 04 pending, thanks to some other contributors as well. So thank you for all of that work on GitHub. And with that, on to discussion items. And I believe this is Justin.
Yeah, I think I'm broadcasting now. Okay, and I will say before we move on that last one, a big thanks to Fabian for taking the lead on the terminology discussion. There was even though it kind of counts as editorial because it's not changing the technical stuff, naming stuff is hard. And he did a lot of really good work to move that forward. So thanks for that. All right. So we did a lot of work since the last IETF. And so the question now is, what are we working on next, right? So today we're going to talk about two things in detail. Fabian's going to be discussing subject identifiers and identifying users and different use cases that tie into that. And I'm going to be spending some time talking about these on-device use cases and the fallout from that. In some of the interim calls, we had a lot of discussions about self-sovereign identity and how that could relate into the GNAP world. And so I'll be talking about that a little bit later on. But there's two other issues that I wanted to touch on really quick here. We're not planning on getting in depth in either of these on this call, but the editors have identified all of these areas as things that we're going to try and prioritize between now and the next IETF meeting for work on this specification. Other things obviously will come up, other discussions that happen in the working group will happen, but this is at least where we're looking to start ahead of IETF 111. So first off, there are a lot of questions about how we handle key presentation and message signing in the draft. And there are some changes happening outside of the GNAP working group that we're going to be benefiting from. First off, the HTTP message signature draft is progressing in the HTTP working group. It's was a little bit stuck for a bit and trying to help get that unstuck because I think that's going to be useful for a wide variety of things, not just for us here in GNAP. Also, thanks to some implementation experience from Aaron and myself, we've got some ideas and some feedback from some other folks posting in the issue tracker. We've got some ideas on how we might be able to change how we're using the Jose-based signature mechanisms to make them a little less awkward in practice. And this goes to show that getting multiple engineers to implement something and see where they disagree, that's where you can really figure out where the standard needs some work. I also wanted to point folks in the group there that there's another group, the FABI working group over in the OpenID Foundation, is working on a profile of OAuth's DPoP signature mechanism that turns out to be very similar to what we have in the core document right now. So we're going to be tracking and coordinating with that as best as we can. And but that leads us to the big question of which of these methods are going to survive into the core document going forward, which, if any, are going to be mandatory to implement, and what are the failure states of the corner cases. If a client can only do one thing and a server supports another thing, how do they talk, and how do we signal those things? We don't have that all decided right now, and that's going to be another big effort in line with what Aaron was saying, in terms of simplifying the things that are there in order to make it easier to implement and easier to understand. Another big discussion that we need to have as a working group is managing key rotations. We've got a bunch of different things that use keys all throughout this protocol. It's really kind of built into the fabric of the protocol itself, but we need to figure out how we're going to manage these different states of rotating these keys. What does it mean for a client to rotate a key? Does that mean that all of the access tokens that have been issued to that client, do they use a new key or the old key? Do we allow an AS to separate those? Do we require an AS to separate those? There's a lot of questions about how to do that. In a way that's predictable, because this is deep in the security model of the protocol itself. It's very, very important that this be predictable for all of the parties involved. And on top of that, there's the question of just how do we, from a mechanical level, allow different parties to rotate keys in these different circumstances. These are discussions that we need to have, and some of the things that we hope to be able to tackle within the next few months. But now I'm going to hand it over to Fabienne to talk about one of the big areas that we're going to try and tackle, and that is that of subject identifier. So Fabienne, just let me know when you want the next slide.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. So yes, it's a discussion item. So here again, it's a bit different from the previous items that Aaron has shown. We are really going to discuss a few issues and try to see how we can fix that. And the objective in the end will be to provide a pull request in the next coming weeks. Next slide, please. So the way we decided it would be a good subject to cover is because we looked at the list of open issues, and basically we've got a lot that actually correspond to that subject. So it's either subject identifiers by themselves or assertions, which are related also to the subject as well. So yeah, next slide, please.
Oh, looks like we may have lost Fabienne, or at least he lost video.
Yeah.
Okay, you're back. Yep, you're back.
So the first PR that we can discuss is in paired image status. It's subject types. So it's 184, and thank you, Andrew, for submitting that. So it's good also to say that you can actually participate actively. And in such a case, we actually review the proposal and we actually accepted it, and everyone can actually follow that on GitHub. So here, this specific issue covers subject types. So the idea is when you make a request, you actually can request for instance, as a sub or the email or whatever type you choose. And so what we want to do is to actually support a list of types which will be supported. And that's actually in section 9 of the draft, where you have discovery, and you can actually get the list from the server. So that's in the request, and then in the response, you get the list that you expect. So just to summarize a bit how it works today in the draft, you've got a user part, which is really what the client tells about the current user, what you know from a fact on the client side. So it's really more kind of a hint to the authorization server. Then you've got the request, where you actually can request some information about the user, and the authorization server will actually respond using the response.subject JSON structure, and you can actually get a lot of information from that. So next slide, please. So one of the other issues we had is, so we have 2 issues related to emails. So there's 16 and 42. And basically these 2 issues relate to the same idea that maybe email is not the best way to actually describe the subject identifier. At least it's not the one we want to encourage in most cases, for different reasons. The first one is that we don't have really a good way to make it unique. We don't have any information on the actual policy. And also, we don't really want to tie that to a delivery method. So we need to think about other ways to actually write that. It's not critical as it's only examples, but at least try to find a way to help people use a method which is a bit more secure. So just as a summary for people that that haven't looked at the draft recently, the SEC event is a draft. It's not yet something that has been published as an official RFC, but you do have a lot of interesting things, and there's a new version which has just been published. And so you've got accounts, email, phone, issuer, and you've got also aliases as well. What I would propose is also to cover what I called AS reference or as a reference. It depends if it's specific to GNAP or if it's something generic for the SEC event working group. And that would be a kind of opaque reference to the actual user, and it would be something that's the authorization server would drive. So next slide, please. We also have quite a few discussions on the actual scope of the subject identifiers. So the question mostly is about whether it's global or whether it's a local identifier. And I know that Dennis, for instance, has some more ideas, some more granular ideas on that. Here, what we would propose is to actually take that from the definition that was accepted by the working group. It's said that it's basically a statement asserted locally by NIS about a subject. So here what we are saying is we're not going to cover global unique identifiers. Anyway, we don't really think it's something that could be enforced by GNAP. We don't think it's the role of GNAP to do that. And even if we found a way to generate a global unique identifier, how do you make people use it in practice? Also, you've got a lot of privacy considerations that could hinder such a global unique method. So basically, the idea is more to go around something that's unique to the authorization server. So we can actually identify, and then we can correlate users that are actually identified by the authorization server, but it's not a global system per se. And then, of course, we can decide in more granular ways what we want to do with that, but that's for later discussion. We also had some discussions, especially related to some work that's going on in the OpenID community. So that's issue 171. The idea is that in OpenID, you've got some discussions on how to make the identifiers portable from one implementation to another, or from OpenID Connect to deeds and so on. And so there are basically two ways we could support that. The first one is through sec event aliases, which are already existing in the spec. And then it's related to the subject types that we discussed a bit earlier. And we also have assertions, which are described into the GNAP draft. And then it's assertion types, which are related to that information. So the reason why we can cover portability thanks to that is because you've got a list of options. So either a list of aliases or a list of assertions related to the same identity. And so you can actually get from one system of identifiers to the next. And that's what you've got listed into the issue 171. And you can read the draft of the specification for that. It's interesting. The question, however, is whether portability is really in the scope of what we want to do. It seems a bit more transactional, like going from an OpenID Connect provider to a self-sovereign identity type of presentation. But anyway, what we can do is support interoperability between various identity systems. And so we're agnostic to whether it's OpenID Connect or some other type of identity system, but we need to actually support what exists. And so that's what GNAP, I think, can bring. And the current structure actually helps for that. So next slide, please. So the next issue is related to the OPAC reference. So it's used for several things, actually, in the specification. It's used because in some cases you might want to actually have some identifier that you can use on repeated interactions through the authorization server. Or it could be used because it's actually something a bit like in UMA today, where you actually start from some other system, and so you can actually refer to that subject. And here we have several options. The one that's currently in the spec is what I call option 2. Basically, what we have is it's not called AS reference. It's called a bit differently, but the idea would be to actually have an OPAC reference, or a string, which looks random, and that's actually referring to the current transaction in GNAP. A question that arises here is, do we want to make it only local to the authorization server, basically considering there's only one single authorization server, or do we want to deal with that information a bit like what we have in ESS sub, where you've got basically the server and then you've got the subject identifier, which are separate. So you could have actually a list of GNAP authorization servers potentially. And then you've got option 1, which is more as an extension to sec events. And here what we say by extension is that because we would use a subject type, and we would extend the subject type with a new label, basically. So I called it ASREF, but it could be any other label. So it's just a suggestion here. And here the good thing, if we do that, is that we actually can just reuse the subject identifier types and use the additional types in the registry. So that's something that's the sec event working group has been providing. It's just never being used yet. So we need to actually make it practical to be used within GNAP. So just like you have email or like you have account, you would have AS reference, for instance, or whatever name we choose to use, which would really refer to the internal value that's used as a reference for GNAP. Next slide, please. Another item which is currently discussed into the issues is the assertions. So we do have a subject identifier, and next to that, we've got some assertions. The typical use case that we have in the draft today is OpenID tokens, so ID tokens, that you have here on the right-hand side of the screen. So you've got an example. Today, it's only one value. You've got only one assertion. And the question from issue 43 was, do we want to support several assertions, like an array, or is it enough as just one single value? So what I would propose is actually that it's very useful to have potentially several values here. And so I would propose an array instead of just a single value. Also, we have issue 41, and that relates to what kind of assertions we want to support. So today in the specification, it's written that you've got ID token, that you've got SAML2, and that you could get an extension registry. The question is how that registry would work. That's something we've been discussing a few times already, but we don't have any example actually. What I would suggest is that we keep ID token. It's obviously a use case that we'll need. I suggest also that we look at a few other cases like GWK thumbprints, deeds, and verifiable credentials, which can have some additional values here. So either as identity tokens or as verifiable credentials. And we had a discussion on the issue related to SAML v2. And the idea would be maybe to actually remove it from the core due to XML security. The rest is basically JSON based. And here we would have to deal with something on top of that. And the question is related also to whether we could use that as an extension. I think it would make sense for compatibility reasons, because you've got a lot of systems that are based on SAML's assertions, but it's a good case for an extension. Next slide, please. So this basically basically asks whether we support additional types via subject identifiers or via assertions. For instance, here for deeds and for GWK thumbprints, I basically had in mind that it could be either one or the other. But then when you look at ID token, it makes sense to actually put that into an assertion. And so it would be just the same for deeds and for other types of systems. So the idea would be that you have an identifier, and alongside this identifier, we would have assertions that could prove some identity or that could prove some facts on that identity. One question which also is important is whether there's a security issue in having a mapping between the subject identifiers and the assertions. It's also it's again the case for the email. And so you do create a kind of association between a weak identifier, like the email, and a stronger identity assertions like an ID token. And this, of course, is a bit less the case if you've got an opaque reference and a stronger identity assertion, because this opaque assertion is related only to the authorization server. And it's also something where in some cases we could use more advanced types like verifiable credentials, for instance. Next slide. Thank you, Justin. So this brings us to the remaining issues, and they all go around the same question. So resource owners versus end users. And that's something we've been discussing quite a lot in the mailing list. And that's something we've been discussing also in many cases during the interim meetings. And so we've got issue, for instance, 197. And we see that in the text today, we've got identifying the user, returning user information. So again, that relates to request.user, and that request to user.user is actually something that you bring, but it also always get back to what's the role of that user. That's something we tried also to clarify during the terminology work. But here, when you look at what's written in the current spec, so you've got, for instance, this text in section 2.4, if the identified end user doesn't match the resource owner present at the authorization server during an interaction step, the authorization server should reject the request with an error. So it basically means that the only case we're covering right now in details, and I think it's correctly covered, is really the case where both match. So you've got the user, which is equal to the resource owner, which is equal to the end user. And if we want to get a bit further for the other cases, we need to have an in-depth discussion about the difference between the two and how we identify in which role we're working. I just want to point out that for the next slides, it's a bit different from the previous items. Here, I'm just presenting my personal thoughts on that, and there's really no discussion that has been going on in the GitHub repository just yet. So next slide, please. So what exists today is in the Oauth world, you've got basically the assumption that basically the resource owner is the same as the end user in most cases. And in UMA 2, you basically consider that they are different. So we've got a few very detailed use cases from participants in the group. And that they're very detailed, but the problem today is we've got a fragmented ecosystem, and each time we've got a new interaction like CBA and so on, we've got to think again from scratch. And what we want to do also with GNAP is try to solve this issue too. Especially in the specification, we've got some diagrams at the beginning of the document. So we've got 1.4.3, which is really asynchronous consent. And what we mean by that is we're going to reach out to some remote resource owners at some point. We've got also a sequence diagram 1.4.4, and here it's software only authorization, what in my own parlance I call automated rule engine. And the problem is section 4, which is about interaction, only covers sequences 1.4.1 and 1.4.2, which also are the ones that Aaron actually described earlier. So that's the user interface interactions. So either via redirect or via NAP, or in some cases via a push-based interaction. So it's pretty innovative already, but we don't really cover the case where we need to do something where the end user is a bit different from the resource owner. So next slide. So here, what we want to try, at least as an idea, is to actually try to know when the resource owner is the same as the end user or not. So in Oauth 2 or UMA 2, what we've seen is that it's basically hard-coded in the protocol. What we want to have in mind also is that ultimately it's the decision of the authorization server. It's something that he should validate. He should make sure that he's the one that's responsible for that choice. And in many cases, at least for complex applications, the only way to know for sure is when you've completed the user's authentication. You don't always know ahead of time. So there's a limit to what we can do. But there's also opportunities because you can have repeat interactions and things like that. And there's also the question on how much we want to expose to the client. For instance, if we're using a specific secret password to actually be able to become a resource owner, then probably the authorization server shouldn't actually convey that to the client in any way. But still, if we look at the sequences 1.4.x, we can actually see that there's a way that we can actually put some hints, just like we actually do today with request.user. Maybe it's something that we could try out a bit further. So next slide. So the intuition is basically that the end user generally knows whether it's his data or someone else's. That's really the difference between the two cases. And the client, in many cases, will actually implement that logic ahead of time. You know that if you need to do some open banking application, you're going to aggregate some accounts. And you know that if you're a doctor and you need to access to some patient data, you're going to ask for them to access to the data. So one way to solve that part would be to actually have an optional principle, what I call the structure principle. And it's really an hint for the authorization to determine who the resource owner is. And so next slide, please. We'll see what it would look like. So for instance, here I've got a subject structure, so exactly the same as what we had earlier. We still have the subject types, so that's what I'll ask to the authorization server. And here I introduced the RS reference. I could ask also some assertions, and actually I described what I called hints, which are optional. So you don't have to provide them, but you can in the request. And I described actually the part in two sections. The first one is self, and that's what I actually described as the equivalent of what we have today as a request.user. Self is just used here to clarify that it's not meant as a role. User is a bit ambiguous, so it's just to clarify, but the rest of the structure is exactly the same. And then you would have principal, and principal is here to actually provide additional hints when it's not, when the user is actually not the resource owner. Of course, all of that is just a suggestion to the authorization server just to help him make the right decision. But then we've got issue 49, which is probably the most difficult to solve. And it's something we've got in many places already in the issues, is whether it's a should or whether it's a must. But at least you've got the idea that the hint is only something that's going to try to help, but the authorization server is the one that makes the decision. Next slide, please. So if we look at the practical sequence, so 1.4.3, I imagine one case, which would be a parental control app, and you've got a child that's actually going to ask for approval of his dad. So obviously, the end user is a child, and the remote resource owner is the dad in that case. So you've got principal, and the way I described it is async, because it's sequence 1.4.3 is actually described in the sequence diagram as asynchronous. Then you've got resource owner, and the resource owner it would be a subject also. And here you've got an assertion, and within that assertion, I didn't put the entire stuff because it's limited in space, but it would be a decentralized identifier, for instance, in that case. Of course, you've got many questions on how do you know it's a legitimate deed and so on, but we can probably deal with that. And it's, in any case, that's a question we would have as soon as you've got some remote connections to make. So that's the first way to, well, that's the first sequence we can deal with, so remote owners here. And on the next slide, we've got the proposal for sequence 1.4.4. So here you've got the automated rule. So the use case is the child wants to watch a film, but maybe he's too young. So usually the way that you could implement that is, so in the self structure, you've got an assertion, like you've got a verifiable credential on the date of birth, or you've got a zero knowledge proof on the age. And then in the principal structure, you would just say that it's automated. So it's not asynchronous here. It's just an automated rule running on the authorization server. And we say true to activate the automated rule. So the client would actually say that to the authorization server, please check the automated rule to actually accept or deny the access to the film. So next slide, please. The idea also is to actually make it composable. So assign could fail. So that's one of the big issue with trying to reach out to remote resource owners. So it could be unavailable. So the dad could be doing something else, or he couldn't respond quickly enough. Or maybe he's doing some other work or whatever. And on the other case, if you are using an automated rule ending, it could be limiting. Maybe the child wants to request special permission. Okay, I'm not of age, but I've been nice, so maybe I should actually be able to try some fallback. So here, I in the slide I've put none, but you could try to actually reach out to the dad or whatever. So the idea is it could be composable if we do that. And on the next slide, we could actually even potentially reach out to multiple resource owners, which is something we don't really see as a typical use case because it's a bit limited. But we could imagine, for instance, that the child would actually reach out to the dad, but maybe mom is nicer, and so we would want to actually reach out also to mom. But in the general case, what we'd like to do is to be able to actually manage potentially resources which are shared between multiple parties. And so that's what we could do here. Of course, we need to keep it simple. So I imagine something like quickest all or quorum. Of course, if you've got only one arrow, it would be ignored. But then if you've got multiple resource owners who share the decision, you need to decide how the decision would be. So maybe it's going a bit too far. I don't know if it's something we want to do, but at least we can imagine that it could be something. Next slide, please. So the exercise is interesting because it shows that here in yellow, you've got subject ints, which is a new structure to actually provide some ahead of time int to the authorization server. So the idea is you've got the self structure or the user structure in the current version. You would add the principal description, which is optional also. And automated is an internal structure within the principal structure, which is also optional. And based on that, it would be a kind of help for the authorization server to determine what to do. And so depending on the values you take, it would actually bring you to the different sequences. So today, the only two that we cover are on the top-hand side of the right-hand side of the screen here. So sequence 1.4.1 and sequence 1.4.2, and both basically correspond to the case where you've got a user interface that's used, and basically you send the end user to this interface because he's also the resource owner. And the two cases at the bottom of the screen in blue are the two additional sequence diagrams that are actually in the draft today, but aren't really covered in detail, and especially in section 4. And the fact that we have deeds in the example allow to imagine something like a DIDCOM engine to actually communicate, and we'll see that in the next slide. So DIDCOM could be used as a delivery method in that case. The assumption would be that the authorization has its own DID, and that's additional complexity, to be honest, because you need to manage it as well. But then if you do that, you've got DIDCOM that can be used for remote interactions. So that's obviously useful for case 1.4.3. And I would still consider that the client has to know the deeds. We wouldn't have some kind of automatic discovery of deeds or whatever. I think it's completely out of scope. But if we do that, we've got an easier integration with self-sovereign identity. And it's also something, more importantly, for GNAP that allows asynchronous patterns to reach remote owners. And for sequence 1.4.4, so it's a rule engine, so it could be technically within the authorization server. But if we use DITCOM as a generic engine, it could be interesting more as a message bus to decouple the actual logic from the policy engine. So here it's not mandatory at all. It's something we could do, or we could decide that it's not something we want to go for. But actually, it's something that could be used as a technical framework. Just to get back also on terminology, so 197 and 198 are related to that. So it's Dennis that has asked this question, and that's interesting because he was saying that subject is something where it's mostly human, which is true. But here we see that in some cases, the subject will actually be a machine that could be a rule engine from a company, or it could be some other device from a remote owner. Next slide, please. And so here we get back to a kind of extension proposal to what Aaron has been showing at the beginning of the slides of the session. So it's the same interact description that we had. It's just that here in the start value, I actually added DITCOM. So that's actually something that was already discussed in XYZ back in the time. We would have to find a way to finish the interaction as well to notify the client back. And here it's another example for ints. So we saw that we had some user interface ints, but here it would be a timeout, which would be meaningful for async request. I just put 10 minutes here, but we would need to define the format, obviously. So we could use either DITCOM or DITCOM query, but the idea is it would be an additional transport mechanism to actually reach out to either remote owners or maybe even automated rule engines. Next slide, please. So in terms of benefits and downside, so what I've tried to imagine is how we could actually carry out some role identification. It doesn't at all remove the need for runtime evaluation by the authorization server. Actually, I would even suggest it increases that requirement because the authorization server ultimately is the one that actually decides about what's going on. So even if you got ints from the client, it's something that you need to validate. That said, it does provide a dynamic configuration of all sequences. And so far, we didn't have that in the spec. You've got a syntax, which is just a proposition, but it's at least I tried to make it as light and composable as possible to mix also synchronous and asynchronous types of interactions. It also clarifies when you've got a web user interface and when you don't. So, for instance, with DITCOM, you could have any kind of client that's actually compatible with the messaging infrastructure, and also trying to having an int that actually includes what we currently have as a request.user. It's actually clarifying who's concerned, so that's entirely embedded within a subject structure now. You can actually cover the interaction within the interact structure, and the what is really related to the client. And of course, we've got a lot of security and privacy considerations. I don't pretend to have solved that right now, and anyway, should and must, again, is kind of an issue. So we'll have to deal with that. Next slide, please. And I think it's the last one. So just a word to say that all your feedbacks and comments and suggestions and text proposal will be very welcome. So here today, the goal was to actually try to reflect a bit on what we have as issues and propose a few ideas. You've got here a summary of my personal preference. It's just a suggestion. Again, it's not as an editor. It's just to try to generate some ideas. And you've got the kind of summary compared to what we said today. The only difference with the slides, that's also a personal preference here, is that due to one of the previous comments I had on whether linking subject identifiers on assertion would be potentially a security issue, is to try to determine whether we should have it as a main structure or whether it's only in the int part that we actually support sec events. So that's something we should discuss, I think, also with the working group related to sec events. But at least we've got a good starting point. So I'll stop here. I'm just on time, but yeah, thank you very much.
We the editors budgeted
Yeah,
some questions here, so.
Yeah, so before we continue, let's have blocks of, if possible, shorter blocks of presentation and put more emphasis on discussion. I'll start with a note. I'm also co-chair of SEC event, and there was, as you noted, there was a new version of the subject ID draft just published today. I think I don't have an acknowledgement from the authors yet, but I think they will want to move it to working group last call. So if there are important changes that we want in that draft, I think this is a great time to do it before now and the next IETF, instead of trying to register additional tags after the fact, where we still don't have a process for it, and it will be more difficult to get it aligned with the architectural thinking of the SEC event working group. So let's present it to SEC event as soon as we can.
Yes, that's the idea.
Other questions or comments? There was some discussion on the chat during Fabienne's presentation. Otherwise, let's move forward.
Okay, let's see here. All right, next topic. This has been brought up around GNAP a lot, and that's how do we deal with self-sovereign identity and sort of these new architectures that are growing up kind of outside of the OAuth world, really. So for some context, I've been doing some work with the DID working group, the Decentralized Identifiers working group in the W3C for the last year or so, year or two. I've been following the work with self-issued OPs over in the OpenID Foundation, which is looking to use that type of stuff around an OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect structure. And there seems to be a really big desire from kind of the wider internet community to be able to use GNAP in these kinds of spaces where OAuth 2 has shown that it's not a great fit. So you can make it fit, and the PSYOP work is showing how to do that. But one of the interesting consequences is that PSYOP makes use of the hybrid flow, which is of course based on the implicit flow from OAuth 2, which has now been deprecated in OAuth 2.1. And so what you have are right now are kind of hacks built on hacks, built on hacks, built on hacks, because we're using systems in ways that we didn't dream of a decade ago, and using new technologies that weren't available a decade ago. So with GNAP, I really believe we've got an opportunity to take a better stab at this. And but I think it's going to be really, really important for us to get this right. I think it's going to be really important for us to look at the architecture and interconnections of all of these different things the right way. So traditionally, this has been talked about as the bring your own authorization server problem. And the kind of naive way to do this is to say, okay, so the authorization server is a function of your device, something that you carry with you, and it issues the access tokens. It authenticates the user. Great, we've got ways to do that. It has means of doing cryptographically verifiable items and things like that. It can even potentially issue things to the client application. One of the places where this really breaks down, though, is how does the resource server know how and when to trust these access tokens that are being issued on some user's device, right? Like, what recourse does it have? And in order for that boundary to work, you really have to start defining things like non-opaque structured tokens and requiring those in order to be able to convey information across these boundaries in a trustful manner. Now, it seems even more obvious when you're talking about the case where the client and the auth server are both under the user's control on the user's device. And we found that in the OAuth world, even trusting a new untrusted client is a hard enough proposition, with OAuth's client IDs and all of this other stuff, that this pattern of just doing everything on the user's device, it seems to make sense from sort of a naive point of view, but there are a lot of problems when you actually drill down into doing this. And we're seeing this a lot with the PSYOP work. It's like, how do you discover an authorization server that's not reachable from HTTP, right? So if you've got a client that's not on the device, but you still want the user to be able to authenticate it, how do you do that? How does the RS get introduced to this? How does the RS trust this? There's a lot of problems that arise from this pattern. Oh yeah, I've covered all of that text already with my ramblings. Okay, so what really ends up happening when you bring your own auth server in practice, and we see this in OAuth 2 deployments all the time today, is that you end up people building out kind of a proxy authorization server. So the actual authorization server or actual resource server is somewhere internal, and whatever you present to this proxy AS, be it an API gateway or some other thing, ends up being translated to something internal for the actual resource servers to consume. This is a well-known pattern, it's well understood, and it's going to keep happening. Like, people keep using this. But now, really, we've just shifted the problem of trusting what comes in from the user away from the actual downstream resource server to a component whose job is dedicated to doing that. So what I want to ask is, are we actually, in this case, are we actually even talking about the user bringing their own authorization server anymore? Or are they bringing something else? So if we look at the authorization server most fundamentally as a token factory. So this is the thing that gathers a whole bunch of information about who's making the request, who's authorizing the request, and all of this. And its job is to issue an access token that can be used at the elements that it's protecting, resource servers that are downstream. this is completely in line with what OAuth 2 defines. This is completely in line with what GNAP has defined so far. But what I want to push back on is this sort of implied notion that the authorization server has to have the user log into it and the user interact with it directly in order to fulfill these claims. Because what we're seeing with all of this technology, with verifiable credentials, DIDs and whatnot, is a new way to identify users and a new way for users to present verifiable information to a third party. And that third party, I am contending, can be the authorization server, can be the GNAP authorization server. So the way that this pattern works is that when the client instance starts its negotiation with the authorization server, like Fabian showed in his proposed syntax, one of the things that it can say is, hey, I know how to present a bunch of verifiable credentials from the user. I can get you in touch with their digital wallet through DIDCOM or any other kind of mechanism that you like. I can facilitate that connection. So if you want to interact with the user that way, do that. So in this way, we can facilitate the pattern of the user interacting not with the authorization server, but with a separate party. It might be a device on their wallet, it might be a different web service entirely, as long as the AS has a way to make those connections. And it doesn't have to be up to GNAP to define all of the ways those connections can be made, very importantly. So GNAP can solve the common use case of, oh, I just need to get the user in front of a web page at the AS. We've got ways to do that. OAuth has showed us how valuable that is, and that's wonderful. But for the cases where the user's not doing that, we shouldn't be pretending that that's what we're doing. And that's fundamentally, that's what the self-issued OP work from OpenID Connect does. It pretends that you're doing a redirect-based, web-based type of thing where fundamentally you're really doing something else. And so what I'm proposing is that we shift our terminology a bit and shift how we're approaching what each of these components does in a way that will facilitate this more general type of thing. And the best part about this, if you ask me, is that we're not even inventing this. Like, this has been around, this pattern has been around for ages. If you go to any of the cloud-based OAuth providers out there right now, they have mechanisms for a federated login to the authorization server. So there's no account at the AS that the user is authenticating to. And in some cases, the user's not even providing interaction and consent. It's just the AS is being told through an assertion that this is the user that is here right now. You'll trust me because you've been configured to trust me, and you can validate this. And then the AS takes that information and says, okay, well, that means that I can issue a token. The problem comes from the fact that if you look at how the OAuth 2 core is written, and therefore how a lot of the assumptions that have kind of gone into the start of GNAP are written, we kind of don't admit that this is a possibility. Like, a lot of the assumptions are about, and you look at the diagrams, a lot of the stuff in there is about, oh, now you redirect the user over here. Now you present a code to the user. Now, you do these bits and pieces to move the steps along. And I think that we've got a really fantastic opportunity to codify what we're doing with the AS here in GNAP. We no longer have to assume that the user logs in and interacts there. We no longer have to assume that that the user is, that what the user is bringing is their own access token or their own authorization server or anything like that, which has always been a hard sell. But instead, we can, by shifting this, we can say that, all right, we are allowing the user to bring things to this component, which is the authorization server, but it's no longer the all-seeing, almighty, all-powerful component that it had previously been assumed to be. And this gives us, as Fabian was just showing, some really important extension points for talking about who the user is, who the resource owner is, how we can interact with them. You know, GNAP can provide all of that structure in order to facilitate this style of approach much, much better than we ever had previously. And this this also can allow us to start to talk about the asynchronous and sort of separate user and resource owner use cases that Fabian was just talking about, and that user managed access really brought to the forefront, where the person that's making the request and the person that's authorizing the request are not the same. They're not the same entity. But with GNAP, we have a way to start the process that says that, like, this is what I'm asking for. This is, as far as I know, who's allowed to say yes. And in the cases where it is the same user, we can do all of that direct interaction, and everything will work just like it does in sort of the canonical OAuth use cases. But in the more advanced use cases, we've got a way to reach people. We've got a way to negotiate that this is a way to send this communication across the wire and across even non-HTTP protocols when we're talking to different entities. So fundamentally, I don't think that this is really going to change how this protocol works, and it certainly isn't a big jump from what people are already doing today in sort of weird proprietary add-ons to OAuth 2. But I think that shifting how we talk about it is going to be really important to making sure that we can frame our conversations in how we address these use cases. Because I've seen a lot of problems on the list in people applying terms from the OAuth world and from the GNAP world in ways that really go outside of what each of these different roles does, what each of these different roles is capable of. So yes, you may want to gather claims on an entity that is not the authorization server. You may want to gather consent on something that is not the authorization server. But the authorization server still needs to be told that that consent has happened so that it can issue a token. We should be able to do that, and we can do that, but we can't start saying things like, oh, it's the client that gathers the consent, right? Or it's the resource server that interacts with the resource owner to define consent. Because those roles don't do those things. We need to be very careful about how we're talking about these different roles and how they're fulfilled. So from an editor's perspective, I think that we can continue this conversation about sort of the terminology and defining the roles that Fabian has started. And I think that we will end up addressing a lot of the currently open issues in terms of how we do these different use cases that people want to use GNAP for, but in a way that's not inconsistent with the other use cases that we know people want to do, which is to say all of the OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect stuff that is really well known and understood today. And that's all I had for presentation. I'm expecting this might generate some conversation here, because it has on the list so far. Anybody in the queue?
I see Yaron has put himself in the queue, so go right ahead.
Yeah, so hats off. A comment about terminology, and maybe it's a little bigger than that. When you call the AS token factory, I think you may be putting the emphasis on the output rather than the behavior. And my question is, is it even an AS if it doesn't enforce a policy? So I would say an AS is something that both enforces a policy and generates a token that is the sum total of this evaluation.
Yeah. So responding as an individual, I agree with that. The AS's job is to enforce the policy that includes taking in all of the inputs in order to generate the correct outputs, right? And so what I'm trying to present here is the fact that a lot of those inputs can be managed in sort of ways beyond just the traditional get the user to show up at the AS webpage and push a button that we tend to think about in the OAuth world, right? So yeah, I totally agree. There's policy under that. Sometimes though, like if we look at the, if I go back to the sort of cloud login thing, sometimes the policy at the AS is somebody logged in from this domain and the client is known, it's a known client ID, so spit out a token. That is the sum total of the policy. And I mean, in some ASs, some that I have personally worked on, the policy is spit out a token with whatever parameters, this other external piece of software told me to do, right? So yeah, I agree. But that policy doesn't necessarily have to fit the model of what user is present, what user clicked a button, and they're logged in, and we have an account, and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's the part I was pushing back on, not policy in general.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, though.
Aaron?
I don't think I have anything to add at this point. Justin pretty much summarized it, but yeah, I was just going to echo that the policy doesn't have to be this user is pre-known already and we know about what they're allowed to do. The policy might be this user exists in some external system and I'm trusting that external system to go ahead and make the token, to just go ahead and make the token now. And yeah, we do see that with social login a lot, where an AS might accept Twitter users regardless of who they are. And this would just be an extension of that idea to trusting a particular type of on-device wallet or something like that.
Yep. And so speaking as an editor, the big question before the group is, how do we facilitate all of that in the protocol in a way that doesn't make it ridiculously convoluted, especially for the other simple cases that we know exist? Because we're still going to have two websites talking to each other with HTTP redirects. Like, that's not going away anytime soon. And if we drop that on the floor, we would be doing the community a huge disservice. So somebody else was in the queue. I think they DQ'd. But oh.
Yeah, that's right. And Christina, you're up.
Yeah, I had a question related to what Justin just mentioned. Having worked on self-issued OP, in general, I agree with Justin's comments. But as you know, the self-issued OP model was quite different, as you pointed out, with sort of, the rest of OAuth flows, and, it uses hybrid/implicit flows. So is the point of this discussion to figure out if that's in scope for GNAP discussion too, or is that already in scope for GNAP? Like, are you trying to incorporate that? I'm kind of, like, how do you see the cross points and, what's the goal here?
So if I can restate, is the question, is self-issued OP in scope? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, in essence.
Yeah. So speaking as an individual, I think that the goals or the desired outcomes of self-issued OP ought to be in scope for GNAP, and that's driving a lot of what I'm proposing for, this sort of slight shift in thinking and addressing terminology here. I personally do not think that it makes sense to have either the actual technology or even the model of self-issued OP as part of GNAP. Right. So from a technology standpoint, it relies on starting with a redirect, and that was one of the first things we threw out from OAuth 2. The fact that every type of request starts the same way in GNAP is a really important, deeply important architecture decision. And it drastically simplifies how to work across all of these different very complex use cases. One of the biggest problems that I've seen in the field with OAuth 2 is you have to choose your grant type ahead of time. And that makes a lot of assumptions about sort of who's there, who can say okay, and what you can do next. And in OAuth, there's no way to switch to a different grant type. You just have to kind of throw that out and start something new. And in the wild, we've seen this take the shape of, for example, starting with an assertion-based flow, and then when that fails, do one of the interactive flows. With the structure in GNAP, though, because it's meant to be negotiated over time, you can present the assertion and also say, this is how I can interact, and also say, by the way, I can, here's the user's wallet address if you want to go talk to them. You can present all of that to the AS at once, and then the AS gets to decide which of those pieces that it needs, right? And then to Yaren's point, like that is the policy. That's where the policy comes into play, because the AS needs to decide, which of those bits it needs to act on, depending on what it is you're asking for. Are you asking for information about the current user? Are you asking for information about how to get to an API? What have you. So yeah, from my individual perspective, I think that the goal of allowing the user to bring identity claims and facilitate that through this protocol totally makes sense, and we should totally embrace that. The goal of having the user carry a complete authorization server with them to generate identity claims to their client, I don't think we should do. Again, that's me speaking as an individual, but I don't think that is the right model. Especially because, and I'll get off my soapbox with this, but especially because if you look at PSYOP end-to-end, it can actually always start with an HTTP call. The whole PSYOP discovery and the big debate that's happening in that group right now with what to do with the self-issue.me URLs and how that relates to the issuer. If you count that as the first step, we're not actually doing something that's that different here. It's just we're facilitating it in a way that's consistent with how we facilitate other types of protocol interactions. So did that answer the question?
Well, the mic queue is empty right now. So
Okay. Christina said yes.
Sounds like it.
Okay. So yeah, from an editor's perspective, I don't know if this means probably means we need to change a lot of the framing language in the spec. I think a lot of Fabienne's subject identifier discussion is going to push things in a similar direction. This is the reason why we thought that these were two things that the group should be tackling now, because these are going to change how we frame sort of a lot of the rest of the stuff that we're solving here. And that's all we had for the chair, for the editor presentations. We wanted to leave some time at the end for open discussion and stuff like that as needed.
You need to turn on your microphone.
Process level on SSI, I don't recall an email to the list with your proposal. Did I miss something? Or otherwise, I think we do need to have it very clear on the list before you move forward with a big rehaul.
Yeah, so I sent a message to the list. The subject line is integrating a GNAP AS with wallets and SSI. So that started on February 17th. The last discussion point was on February 25th.
Okay, so that was a long thread.
Yeah. So I could, so I can send a note to summarize kind of this position. And so what I wrote up today was influenced by a lot of what people were saying there, and there seemed to be a lot of I noticed a lot of frustration in trying to get people to talk about the same things using the same words, right? Which is always hard. And so in any event, I can write up a summary of the position that I've sort of put today and drop that on the list, if you would like.
That sounds very good.
All right. I'm assuming Fabian should probably do the same. He's actually got other write-ups that he's already started for that.
Yes, of course. Well, the subject identifier discussion is, so there's really two parts. There's a part that's quite clear because it's basically the GitHub issues, and we just need to take that down. And the resource owner versus subject, well, versus end user is really more prospective. So it's something that I can summarize, but it's very, well, it's really open to discussion. It's really something that we need to cover in the next weeks and months.
Okay, looks like Roman agrees with that step as well. So Fabi and I will each do that with these two main topics, and hopefully we will also, start when there's bandwidth. We'll start the discussions on the key rotation and signing bits as well. Hopefully during this period, and anything else that comes up. Obviously, everything's always on fire.
Okay, Yaron, should we get back to our agenda?
Yeah. So unless we could summarize, talk about next steps, but I don't think there's too much of that, or we could actually use the next 20 minutes for Denis to present his slides. I suggest we start with next steps so that we are clear on the main topics here. So Justin and Fabienne will post to the list the big issues, the proposed resolution of the big issues that we discussed. And I think we've had 2 interim meetings since the last full IETF. If that works for the group and for the editors, I would suggest that we keep this cadence. Yes, no comments. Okay, thank you. Anything else as far as next steps, Leif?
Not seeing any opposition against to continuing interims. I guess at the pace that the editor team can.
Yes, sorry, Leif, your mic is not great. All right, so we have another 19 minutes. So, Denis, I will, unless you prefer to, I will show your slides. In a second. Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. So these slides are available on the server, and they were available today before the meeting. So let us start by the first real slide. Well, I took the component of the model and I discovered something which is not very difficult to discover, that there was 3 components: a client, an authorization server, and a resource server. What is very important in the client definition is that it is possible that the client, of course operated by an end user, consumes resources from one or several RSs, but possibly requiring privileges from one or several authorization servers. The plural is very important. So in the general model, there is not one authorization server, but there are several authorization servers, and a single resource server can have relationship with several authorization servers, or more clearly, he has no relationship, but he can trust more than one authorization server. What is important in the definition of authorization server is that it grants privileges. And it's very important to understand that privileges can be either an attribute or a right. And with these 2 terms, there are clearly 2 models behind that. When you consider attributes, you are going to have access control list. And when you consider rights, you are going to have what is called usually capacities. So the model should be able to accommodate both attributes and capacities, access control list and capacities. Now, when you look at the definition of the resource server, I have a problem with the definition because it only speaks on protected resources and speak about a valid access token. What is a valid access token? Is it a GNAP token, a Oauth token, a cookies token? I don't know. If I look at the ISO definition, there is no concept of protected resource. It's simply an access to an object which is controlled by the resource server. So I would propose a definition that is slightly different. It's a server that provides operations to objects referenced by specific client request. It means that this resource can be protected by, let us say, an authentication mechanism, by other means of protection, and of course, can be protected using GNAP tokens. Now, another concept which is not in the document, but I think it is important to add, is the concept of service. An API really is an abstraction layer for accessing a service which must be fulfilled by a set of resource servers. And it's important that resource servers may publish to which kind of service it applies, so that in an access token, you can target maybe the token to the first RS, but then you know that this token can be forwarded to a service to which this resource service provides. Next slide. Now, I have a problem with the current document because we have a model, but the trust relationships are left undefined. So I look at the Oauth model first, and I look about the problem of scalability. In Oauth, the token format is defined between the RS and an AS using out-of-band means. Hence, you must have a relationship between every RS and every AS. This is typically not scalable. What I would like to have in GNAP is something scalable. The access token format should be advertised using some protocol by both the RS and the AS, example using discovery mechanism, so that the common format may be discovered and or negotiated. If you have discovery mechanism for the AS, it can disclose which token format it supports, and the same for the RS. Now, in terms of trust relationship, so it is an important point. The RS trusts a set of authorization servers for some set of privileges, which may be rights and or attributes that are contained into an access token from one of more the trusted authorization servers. With such relationship, we don't need to have a prior relationship between every AS and RS. Simply, the RS needs to tell which IS it is trusting. So this is very important because it allows a large scalability and it allows also interoperability. However, in case an AS delivers capabilities on some object on behalf of a resource owner, the AS needs to have some relationship with the RO, but not the RS. So what I believe important is to clarify the trust relationship, to define the relationship in the model, the current draft. Next one. Now, I'm going to go and look at what is really a resource owner. And in my presentation, I have focused on the case where the resource owner is not the subject, basically the end user. I look at the definition of the resource owner, and except it starts by subject, which can discuss that, it is an entity that may grant or deny operation on resources it has authority upon. The resource owner may act on the AS side, and he may also act on the RS side. If you go to the framework, the access control framework, it is an ISO document which is very old. And you have an access enforcement function and an access decision function. The access enforcement function is done by the RS, but the access decision function can be administered by one or more resource owners. The access control rules that are used by the RS may be based on access control list and or may be capability based. The RO administering the RS in that case may be a process, a human being, or a device in the IoT case. Now, for each method requested by a client on an object, The rules from the RO indicate which method may be granted. Some rules may allow the use of some methods without the need to present an access token. It may be a public access or an access protected by an authentication mechanism. And of course, while some other rules may require one or more access token from one or more authorization servers. In the last case, there is a combination of authorization server URL using O and N operators. And when these rules are based on access control list, they indicate which attribute types and attribute values issued by that AS must be presented to be able to use a method on the object. And when it is capability based, they indicate which method issued by that AS must be presented to use a method to the object. Next slide. Now let us focus only on the case when the access control rules are capability based. In that case, the AS must cooperate with the RO able to deliver capabilities on the object of the RS under his control. In that case, the RO may be either a process or a human being. So you see that the RO in one case may be process human being, in another case may be process human being or IoT. So it's not exactly the same. What is very important is when there is a RO associated with an AS that delivers a capability on a resource under the control of the RS, that capability is analyzed and filtered by the access decision function on the resource server side. And then it can filter which method delivered by a given authorization servers can be accepted. It means you have two arrows, one on the RS side, and you may have an optional arrow on the authorization server side. Next slide. Now, there is an illustration, and you have 5 steps in this figure. Well, this is the different component. You have the client, different authorization servers, and RS. So first step is the client makes a call to the RS. The next step, the RS responds, and fine, and then the client asks an access token to the AS. Next step. If there is a RO involved because capability is being used, then it may issue capabilities for that client, for that end user, in fact. And final step, when the token is forwarded to the RS, you see now the RS at the acronym AEF. It is the access enforcement function. And final step, you see that the RO is an access decision function. And that RO exists in both cases, whether access control list or capabilities are being used. And it fits well with the definition that I have written at the bottom of the slide. Fits well because it's a subject, it's an entity, I will not say subject, it's an entity that may grant or deny operation on resources it has authority upon. So there are 2 kinds of basically RO. Now, maybe it would be better to use 2 terms, but at the moment, the terminology fits to the 2 RO shown on the figure. Next step. Now, maybe some people in the working group know already that I am very concerned with privacy. And I have done some design using privacy by design, which means that you identify the privacy requirement first, once you have the model component, and once you have the trust relationship. Since we have no trust relationship, it's impossible to do a privacy by design at the moment. And then you must do that before you define the protocol, because then you define protocols in order to fulfill the trust relationship and the privacy requirement you have identified. Section 14, privacy consideration, simply states 3 lines and the following sentence, there are a lot of privacy consideration to add. My belief is that section should be filled before doing all the design of the protocol, because privacy after design is usually unable to address privacy consideration which has not been considered before the design of the protocol. And I will focus on two important privacy considerations: user choice and consent, and user notice. Next slide. In the current draft, user consent is only considered to take place at a single authorization servers. However, as soon as the RS is trusting more than one RS, the end user must be able to make at least the choice of one or more authorization servers before consenting any AS. So there must be some choice phase before a contact to an AS. Furthermore, the end user must be able to be informed of the reason or the rationale for which reason each privilege is requested by the RS before requesting an access token. And this call is called user notice. And every end user should be able to agree upon the rights and all the attribute types and value he accepts to be placed into the access token. These two steps are currently unsupported and missing in the draft, and they are pretty important in order to address privacy considerations. Next slide. Now, this is rather important. An end user identifier, which may be present in an access token, may be of four types. It may be a globally unique identifier. It may be an identifier locally unique to the AS. It may be an identifier unique for a pair of AS and RS, or it may be a temporary identifier for a single access or for a single session. What is important to explore the consequences when you look at the privacy property and one security property. One privacy property, for example, that is met if you use FIDO, First Identity Online, its two resource servers should not be able to link their user accounts by using the content of the access token they receive from the same RS or from different RS. And one security property, two collaborating clients should not be able to anonymously use access token of the other client on the same RS. For example, if you could believe that you have an access token that say, I am older than 18, well, there should be some way to be able to detect that something is wrong if one client sends that token to the other. It means that the token should contain something else. Next slide. Now, I have addressed the implication of what are the differences when using the 4 and even 5 types when you have no user identifier at all in an access token. If you look at the privacy property, if you use a global unique identifier, well, obviously, as soon as two RS receive that, they can link the account. It is the same if the RS using the same identifier for all the RS. So you can't meet this property. What is more important is to look at the third choice, a unique end user identifier for every AS pair. Then you can meet. Of course, for the two last, you can meet them too. Now, for the security property, if you include a globally unique identifier into an access token, then you may know that this access token is for that person and not for that other person. So if you think you have a capability that say you are over 18, well, you are able to detect that there is something wrong. And the consequences is the following. If an access token that only contains one or more capability is sent, client collaboration attack will succeed. However, in order to defeat that attack, the access token must also contain a type 1, 2, or 3 end user identifier. So this is a major implication. And
Kenny, time check. We have 1 minute to go, so we'd better wrap up.
So next slide. So this is a summary of what you can figure out when you use ACL only or when you use capabilities only. And the final one, which is a slide 12, I have a look at the document subject identifier for security event tokens, which define a sub-ID claim. And I sent that slide yesterday to Yaron, and I said that a liaison will need to be established, where he said you can ask directly. And I did that, and I made a proposal today to the two editors of the working group to be able to accommodate the 5 types of identifiers that I've explained today. That's it.
All right. I think we're gonna have to end there, Denis. So I think you presented this to the editors, and I think maybe submit the summary to the mailing list. I'm pretty sure we get cut off at the top of the hour, or at least very shortly after that. So this was very interesting, Denis, and we'll see what the working group does with this once it hits the mailing list. Yaron, any final words?
Nothing from me. Thank you, everyone, for the presentations, and thank you for being so involved in moving this protocol forward. And this is it for now. See you at the next interim.
See you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You, bye-bye.